Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Just a little note, I have a subscription service available for this podcast series. You're able to get the episodes released to you a week prior, and you also get access to bonus episodes. There are currently 11 bonus episodes available to you to listen to, and they are exclusively only to subscribers. For only the price of a coffee a month, you can sign up. Some of the bonus episodes: there is one on Alphaeus Barrington's son, Jack Barrington, who was a mystery to me largely, and I uncovered some really interesting information about him. He was a professional whistler who travelled around South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. There's also an extra episode to The Tracker, where it talks about the ladies from Warringah's Mission and uncovers some interesting information about the Aboriginal ladies that came from that area and the links to episodes. I've also got Ray Blair's extra to her episodes on Theo's duty. And I've also got some follow-up episodes related to the Deniliquin Bank robbery, Harry Power and his family in Australia, the bushranger Frank Gardner, his family as well, are covered in a bonus episode. So I would appreciate it if you would consider assisting me in my research in the time that it takes and sign up to subscribe. I also have a Facebook page, so when you're listening to the stories, tune into the Facebook page, Family History Mysteries, as I add photos and documents and other pictures that relate to the person, so you can put a face to the name as you're listening to the podcast. Episode 90, Part 1. Was Jack the Ripper in Australia? Warning, there is graphic information contained in this episode. I had never heard of a Frederick Deeming, nor had I heard of the crimes that this man perpetrated. And there are many theories, partly due to the fact that he'd fabricated a lot of stories, and also with the media of the day, quite often things were not cross-checked. So I've attempted to go through and research in a timeline with Frederick Deeming. How this came about was I discovered an article about the grisly discovery of a female's body that was found buried beneath the hearthstone of their home in the Melbourne suburb of Windsor, and the police investigation to help find her murderer, and the eventual arrest and trial in the early months of 1892 of Frederick Bailey Deeming. This arose intense interest by the Australian public, and it uncovered bizarre and disturbing crimes that earned him the reputation of being the criminal of the century and quite possibly Jack the Ripper. Frederick Deeming made a career as a globe-trotting seducer and a conman. He had striking good looks, blue eyes, a distinctive fair moustache, and he was overall described as ruggedly handsome. He also had an engaging way with words. He could on occasions pass himself off as a gentleman of aristocratic birth, and women would quickly succumb to his charms. However, he usually drew attention to himself with behaviour described as aggressive, ostentatious, ingratiating and overly attentive to women, and he was known to visit brothels and to develop a hate for sex workers. A woman, Miss Salter, who was very lucky to escape his clutches, got to know him a little bit intimately, and she said that if there was ever a one that had a Jekyll and Hyde character, it was Frederick Deeming. Frederick Bailey Deeming used as many as 14 aliases throughout his life, including Albert Williams, Frederick Bailey Williams and Baron Swanston. I've attempted to refer to him as Deeming for most of the episode. However, if I am referring to statements that are made in regards to his trial, often I have had to use Williams or Swanston as well. He was known in his local township in England as Mad Fred, and was also dubbed in the press as the Demon. Frederick Bailey Deeming was born on the 30th of July 1853 in Leicestershire, England. He was the youngest of 7 children, born to Thomas Deeming, a tinsmith, and Anne Bailey. He was reported to have been a difficult child, and, as mentioned, was known in his youth as Mad Fred due to his abnormal behaviour. There are a couple of theories in terms of his father. One was that he used to receive savage beatings by his father, who ended up dying insane in a workhouse after having attempted suicide on 4 occasions by slashing his throat. By all accounts, Deeming had a stifling relationship with his Sunday school teacher mother, who instilled her puritanical interpretation of the scriptures on him. She was very religious, and this followed through in his life. He carried a Bible with him on all of his travels, and people that ran into him said that he was obsessed with the concepts of sin and punishment. But then there are other accounts in his childhood saying that he came from a loving and supportive family. His mother, Anne, died in 1877. His father, Thomas, died on December 1889 in the UK. He was 65 when he died in the workhouse. Thomas, in fact, actually remarried to Martha Clervely 4 years before he died. At the age of 12, Frederick Deeming was a plumber's apprentice. He turned his private obsession for knives into a side business, making them to sell to sailors. A teenage Deeming found a woman, Min Cooper, dead on the front doorsteps of their family home in England. Her throat had been cut. Deeming was a suspect in her death, but the case was never solved. Detective Inspector Charles Marshall investigated the murder, and he observed that when questioning Deeming, he was excited by his grisly find. On the 7th of February 1868, at the age of 15, Deeming was caught throwing stones at a railway carriage, and he was put to trial at Cheshire on the 6th of August 1868. However, his sentence was acquitted. By the time he was 16, he ran away to sea, and he worked as a steward on a number of ships. And this is when he began a career of crime. He largely thieved and obtained money under false pretences. He masqueraded as a member of the respectable classes on some of the ships, and his travels frequently took him into London's Docklands area and nearby Whitechapel, where he indulged his taste for prostitutes. Deeming bragged that by the age of 18, I'd seen more of life than most men ever see. I had killed a man too. It was partly an accident, but it changed my life. When his mother died in 1875, he was 22, and it came as a crashing blow to him, and it was reported that he'd suffered a mental breakdown that later turned his mind into a compulsion to kill. He returned back home in 1880. According to his stories that he told, that when he returned home to his family, he had visited nearly every country on the globe in his travels as a steward, and he appeared to be well-to-do. He told everyone he was a mining engineer and that he had successfully engaged in opening up mines in Ballarat, Victoria in Australia, and he'd spent a year at various English seaside ports, Blackpool, Morecambe and Scarborough, with periodical visits to London. Within a year of returning home, he went into partnership with his brothers, Albert and Walter, as plumbers and gas fitters at Birkenhead in England. However, the partnership soon dissolved quite quickly. In February 1881, Frederick Deeming married Marie James, a Welsh woman, and they married in Lower Tranmere in England. They were both 28 when they married. His brother Albert had actually married Marie's sister Martha. 2 months after they married, Deeming suddenly announced that he was returning to Australia, and apparently did so, saying that he would send for his wife. On the 13th of June 1881, as recalled by recollections of a Mr. de Tors, who was a native of Ella Present, South America, who'd in fact moved to Australia and was living in Adelong, New South Wales, around the time that Deeming was arrested for his crimes over a decade later, he made this statement: "I wish to say something that will throw more light on Deeming's career. He came to America as a passenger on the SS Sardinian from Halifax. We travelled together to Chicago on the 13th of June 1881. We were met by a woman who went with us to Bell Creek. I got a job on the railway line and he got a job gas fitting and working as a fitter for about 3 months. I asked where the woman, who he called Miss Carruthers and termed his sister, where she was, and he told me that she had left to go back to Liverpool, England. He and I fought as he did not pay back $30 that he borrowed from me, and he disappeared all of a sudden, no one knowing where he was. All of the debts that he paid before leaving were in false cheques, and he got £50 change. A person came to live at the same house that he had lived in on the 14th of January 1882, and the wife complained to the landlord of a stench arising from the drains and the floor. When the floor was taken up, the body of this lady was found in quicklime. Another girl's body, aged 19, was found in the water closet. The sheriff was sent around, and there was no trace found of him. The sheriff did discover that he was using the aliases Williams, Johnston, Campbell, Squire and Carruthers in that time. In August 1881, he writes back home to England and organises his wife Marie to sail to Melbourne. However, it was learnt later that neither she nor Deeming went to Melbourne. The next they heard of, they were in Cape Town, South Africa, where Mrs. Deeming wrote to friends saying that Frederick was very prosperous, making a great deal of money in mining ventures, but there was no explanation why they had not gone to Melbourne. Again, Mr. de Tours recalls that him and Deeming went together to Rio, Brazil. He shot 2 mates and committed a criminal assault on a girl, and these 2 brothers came on him. Doing such, he killed all 3. He shot and wounded me in the breast and then robbed me of £58, 12 shillings and 6 in English money. Deeming escaped the Cape. Police detectives watched over him for 6 months. By February 1882, Frederick Deeming is again working as a steward, and he stole clothing and other effects from the mate employed on the vessel, and he arrives in Sydney under his birth name. Upon arriving in Sydney, he was taken up by a friend who originally came from the same part of England. This friend took him to a boarding house at Middle Street, Chippendale, kept by a highly respectable widow. The friend found employment for him at Tooth's Brewery, but this position did not hold long as he quarrelled with the superior. While residing with the widow in Middle Street, Chippendale, he always talked about his dear wife Marion, who he said was in England, and for whose companionship he longed. He was accustomed to sleep with Marion's photograph beneath his pillow, and he was remarked for his consistency in attending St Paul's Church. He apparently made complaints of the ghost that haunted his room at night. On one occasion, he rushed downstairs to his landlady in a state of real or acted terror and said that he was intercepted on the stairway by a ghost. The widow was eventually obliged to get rid of Deeming on the account of his mysterious manner. It also transpired after his arrest that when in Sydney he twice attempted to commit suicide by throwing himself under a tram motor, and he was promptly rescued each time. Next, he lodged in Riley Street, Woolloomooloo. He gained employment with J. Skinner in Darlinghurst. He stole brassware from this employer, and he tried to shift the blame onto the shoulders of a boy. He was imprisoned for 6 weeks. His wife, Marie James, who for some reason he referred to as Marion to his landlord, arrived in Sydney while he was in prison. It was also mentioned that he had an occasional accomplice called Eva Grant while he was in Sydney, and she died after falling from her bedroom following an altercation with him. And Deeming parted Sydney before the police could question him on this. So virtually as soon as he leaves prison, he goes to Adelaide. It says that Deeming worked as a plumber in Adelaide in 1882. He had a wife and 2 children and lived in Peary Street, and afterwards left to take a public house in Kapunda. It is also certain that he sailed from Port Adelaide as Mr. Ward for Western Australia. So this in fact was before he had the first 2 children with Marie James. So a bit of a mystery as to who the wife and 2 children were. On the 10th of May 1883, the family arrives in Melbourne. As Frederick Bailey Deeming, he was employed by Danks and Son in Bourke Street, Melbourne. He was discharged as he did not agree with his fellow workmen. However, John Danks regarded him as an excellent worker, and he actually extended him £200 credit because Deeming told him he wanted to open a business in Rockhampton, Queensland. The money was never repaid to Danks. It also mentions that just prior to going up to Rockhampton, that Deeming went insolvent and he immediately went to Queensland after that. Around this time, he had stated that he had worked as a miner at Charters Towers. He was 28 and was married with 1 child. Their daughter, Bertha, was born in Sydney in early 1883. So on the 6th of July 1883, he's at Rockhampton, and he was employed under a 6-month engagement as manager for the firm William Brothers, who were gas fitters. He only remained there for 2 months. It said it was seen almost immediately after his arrival that Deeming was not the practical mechanic that he had been represented to be, though from this circumstance that he possessed the ability to bring in numerous new customers to the establishment, he was in one way eminently fitted to occupy the position he held. He was a man of very reserved character, sullen and disagreeable. He was at continual enmity with the men in his charge, and the latter frequently had to bring their grievances under the notice of their masters. Matters went on this way for about 8 weeks, when it began to be noised about that Deeming had been threatened by the municipal authorities with the prosecuting of shooting within the bounds of this town. Deeming admitted the offence, and this gave just cause for the firm to sack Deeming. He parted from the firm on fairly good terms, selling some of his tools to them. He still remained in the town for a few months doing odd jobs about the place for different people, generally on the north side of the river. When he came to Rockhampton first, Deeming resided in a house that belonged to Mrs. Hinchcliffe in East Street, but that was only for a few weeks. He then moved to a cottage belonging to Mr. W. K. Higson, where he remained until his departure from Rockhampton further south. He came here with his wife, who was described as finely built and very intelligent. The couple had no children. Deeming made very few friends in Rockhampton, living very quietly, visiting little and receiving few visitors. When he left here, he parted with all of his belongings, selling his furniture at auction. His wife gave Mrs. T.K. Higson a photograph of her husband and herself taken during their residence in Rockhampton. Whilst in Rockhampton, Deeming spoke little of his past. Not once, so far as it has been possible to ascertain, did he allude to his residence in England, and the only relative he mentioned at all was a married sister, who he stated had a large hotel business with her husband in Natal. He also hinted that he'd once been in India. Though taciturn by nature, he was kind to his wife, and their relations whilst in Rockhampton were of the most friendly and cordial nature. It was reported that Deeming resided in East Street in Rockhampton. His home was a beautiful little retreat, being nicely finished and splendidly furnished. Outside the veranda of his 6-roomed villa, he had 4 canaries, all lovely singers and high-priced birds. Deeming was all appearances passionately devoted to his wife, and gave parties where dancing and singing was kept up with great spirit. He was a great sportsman in Rockhampton and was often to be seen accompanied by a dog and gun going for and returning from a day's shooting. Mr. Percy Kehoe, musical director of the Alexander Theatre, who was a frequent visitor at Williams's house in East Street, Rockhampton, made a statement in which he says that Williams appeared to be passionately devoted to his wife and children. In front of the house was a signboard which read Frederick William Deeming, gas fitter, plumber and bell hanger. Repairs attended to with neatness and dispatch. On several occasions, Mr. Kehoe went out shooting with Williams, who was a great sportsman and crack marksman. Towards the end of 1884, Mr. Kehoe left Rockhampton and went to Sydney. He'd not been in Sydney long when one day, while strolling through Surrey Hills, he came upon the old signboard, and on going into the house he met Williams, who said he was doing well. 2 years later, Mr. Kehoe returned to Rockhampton and then learnt that Williams had left a large number of creditors lamenting. This was the last Mr. Kehoe heard of Williams. While at Rockhampton, he stated he was a married man in 28, but he stated he had 2 children and he went under the name of Mollett. And in a timeline in one of the newspaper articles, it mentions that he marries a widow with 2 children at Charters Towers. He robs and deserts that wife, and then he married a daughter of a German settler in Brisbane in 1883. Him and Marie definitely only had 1 child at this time, so I'm not sure whether he's leading a double life and he's leaving Marie behind with the baby at Rockhampton and then going off and actually marrying other women. J.H. Lundager, who was a photographer at Mount Morgan, Rockhampton, recalled after Deeming's arrest that in 1884 I took a bust photo of him and also of him and his wife, and the wife by herself with a 3/4 length and bust photograph. The lady, so far as I can make out, is none of the wives described in the newspapers. Why I know him so well is that he arrived here to manage or rather start a plumbing business for William Brothers Ironmongers. I was then building a residence on the Atherton Rouge, and he did all the plumbing there and also some work for me in the photographic studio. When in Rockhampton, he was well known, especially amongst business people, and was often in my studio. Another article stated that the photograph of Williams was sent to the Commissioner of Police to Brisbane by the Melbourne authorities, and it's been identified by the detectives as being identical with that of a man giving the name of George Denby, and against whom a warrant was issued in 1884 for wife desertion. Denby, on leaving the SS Jumna, went to Redland Bay Hotel. After a few days, he married the cook at the hotel, a widow named Smith. Shortly after the marriage, she gave him all her money, amounting to between £50 and £60, upon the understanding that he was going to Sydney to purchase machinery to start a bakery. On his return to Queensland, he went to Charters Towers, where he married another widow, a warrant again being obtained when he deserted her. Mrs. Smith has a portrait of Denby, taken in 1889 at Brisbane, and also several letters signed only George. These are the same handwriting as the handwriting specimens of Deeming. He leaves Rockhampton in 1885 and returns to Sydney with Marie. They both reside there together, and he works as a plumber for several firms under the alias of Frederick Bailey. And there was a recollection that says that he was in the employ of Mr. Thomas Tuck, plumber of Oxford Street, Sydney. A man named Fred Bailey became employed at Mr. Tuck's to learn the business of a gas fitter at 6 shillings a day, and I worked with him for a period of 9 or 10 months. I had a good opportunity of learning correctly his characteristics. In the course of conversation at various times, he spoke of the unexpected arrival of his wife in the colony. About 2 months after I first came into contact with him, I was invited by him to a house in Riley Street, which he had taken and furnished, and was there introduced to his wife, a massively built and very dark-complexioned woman who by her appearance gave me the impression that she was half-caste. I visited the house when I knew Bailey and his wife. There were no children. In 1886, he went into business on his own as a plumber and gas fitter in Phillip Street, Sydney. This was started under his proper name, and finances embarrassed by reckless extravagance and indulgence in luxuries such as a pony carriage ended up going not so well for him. Their second daughter Marie was born at this time on the 29th of March 1886, and this is when he was still employed at Keating & Co. as a gas fitter and plumber under the name Deeming. And on the 11th November 1886, he became a member of the Freemasons, and it stated that he was a plumber, born 1855, so he's put himself as 2 years younger than what he is. Residence 162 Riley Street. The census at this time actually only had him listed at that address. Other than being extravagant, it seems that everything was quite settled in terms of family at this time. It wasn't until October 1887, so a year later, when he pops up again, where he files his schedule for bankruptcy. He published a bogus advertisement referring to an inheritance. He was actually sentenced to 14 days imprisonment for prevaricating in the insolvent court. And there was an account by John McEwen, an indoor apprentice that worked for Deeming in Sydney at this time, and it gives an interesting account of Deeming's mode of living. It says that he lived with Deeming and his wife. He says that they had 2 children, both girls, and at the time Deeming disappeared, his wife was near her time of birth. He speaks highly of the wife. She was a good little woman devoted to her husband and children, but she always appeared to be nervous about her husband, who was frequently away from the home at night. She often waited up until midnight to get his supper. Deeming lived at Wallara in a cottage, and when he became insolvent, he was living there, and he asked McEwen to dig up the yard in his spare time as he intended on planting trees. The trees were planted, but Deeming altered his mind and took them up and had the yard cemented. He obtained the cement himself, saying that the price he paid was higher than he had to pay in England. He then sent his wife and McEwen away. At this time he had a servant called Bridget, whom he said he would make hold her tongue. He asked him if he intended to discharge her, and Deeming said he knew her way better than that. Bridget disappeared shortly afterwards, and Deeming's wife returned to the cottage. He took his wife for a drive, and his wife said that she would never go for a drive with him again as he had frightened her. McEwen also stated that Deeming also had a weakness for barmaids. A barmaid in King Street had great influence over him and he used to drive her out in his buggy. There was another barmaid in Oxford Street from whom he obtained a diamond brooch, intending to mend it, but he never returned it. The woman was frequently coming into the shop. When the official assignee decided to sell the furniture in Deeming's home, he quickly took up the floor and planted pictures there. At the sale, he asked a friend to purchase all the articles in a certain room. The friend obliged him and Deeming removed everything, forgetting to pay his friend. When in jail, Deeming asked a discharged prisoner to take a letter to his wife, and knowing that a prisoner before being discharged would be searched, he got one of the prisoner's boots, split the soles, and placed the letter in there. 2 months after this, his premises was burnt down by fire, and it was believed to be an insurance fraud orchestrated by Deeming. The schedule for his insolvency was filed, and he had a deficiency of £700, and the books of the business accounts were found to be cooked, and as a result he spent Christmas in jail. He quickly left Sydney at the end of December as soon as he was released to avoid his creditors as they were about to rearrest him for fraudulent insolvency. So he took off whilst on bail and he left his wife and 2 children behind. And in March 1892, with a recollection of a person based in Sydney, they said, "Deeming is now recalled by many Sydney people, by some not altogether with unmitigated pleasure. For instance, a King Street tailoring firm have had on their books an unsatisfied claim for an amount due on 2 suits of clothes, 6 pairs of kids' gloves, 6 pairs of silk socks, collars and hats, all of the very best quality, as Deeming was rather ascetical in regard to what he wore." In the summer of 1887-1888, he was carrying on a business in the city as a plumber and usually drove around in a smart-looking trap. He was an excellent workman, but was much addicted to loquacity. In other words, had the gift of the gab. On one occasion, he stated that he was about to engage in a contract for electrically lighting the exhibition building, but this never came to anything. He was always full of schemes for mechanical inventions. Prior to his departure from Sydney, he said he was leaving for Manchester. He gave the order already mentioned for the clothes, and since then the tailoring firm have never heard of F.B. Deeming up until the present. Prior to letting them in for the sum referred to, he gave the firm many orders which were always paid for at once, hence the confiding nature of the last deal. He left Sydney at the beginning of 1888, and while in Sydney he appeared to be married and was sometimes accompanied by a little boy of 6 years old dressed in a sailor's suit. Also believed he had 2 or 3 other children, but what has become of them is not known. The following is Deeming's business card. F.B. Deeming, plumber, gas fitter, brass finisher, bell hanger, brewery and general inquiries at 91 Phillip Street, Sydney, electric and other bells fitted up, speaking tubes made and fixed, licence to lay on water and gas, beer engines made, repaired and fixed, estimates given, charges moderate. Deeming was also thought to have gone to South Africa as soon as he left Sydney. However, Marie and the children actually joined Deeming in Melbourne almost immediately, and they went to Adelaide as Mr. and Mrs. Ward. They then became acquainted with 2 brothers named Howe at Port Adelaide. The Howe brothers were robbed of £60 in gold, and Deeming, as Ward, was accused of the robbery. Mr. and Mrs. Ward, as they were known, and the family and the brothers Howe, booked to St. Helena by the ship Barossa at the beginning of February. However, on the way, they were kicked off the ship, as Deeming tried to swindle fellow passengers. Their son, Sydney Francis Deeming, was born at sea after changing ships en route to South Africa, and the family arrived in Cape Town in January 1888. Deeming virtually immediately sent his wife and children home to Birkenhead, England, and Deeming, using Ward and other various aliases, committed innumerable frauds at the Cape, sometimes alone and sometimes with accomplices. The areas that were worked by Deeming: Port Elizabeth, Durban, Johannesburg and Natal. A bank was swindled to the extent of £3,000, and a bank manager was ruined at Johannesburg by the bogus company floating trick. £600 was obtained by fraud on a gold commission in Durban. £2,000 was obtained from a gentleman upon the security of an imaginary diamond mine in the Transvaal and by the authority of a bogus telegram. A jeweller named Courtney was robbed, and there were also accounts of Deeming committing murder while he was there. A former detective in South Africa submitted the following report. I report that I knew Deeming, alias Williams, on the Kimberley Diamond Fields at Grismaland West, South Africa. It was there that he first assumed the name of Albert Williams. Subsequently, he was known as Frederick Deeming at Johannesburg in the Transvaal in the South African Republic. In September 1888, 3 murders were committed at Johannesburg. The victims were a white man and 2 natives. The white man was known as Graham, and he was an officer in the British service during the Zulu War. The crime was committed during a very dark night in an out-of-way street in the mining camp at Johannesburg. The street was one in which few people resided. The bodies were very much mutilated. The crime created tremendous public sensation. The Transvaal government did all in their power to vindicate the law, but failed, owing to the want of proper police in the detective system. After much trouble and expense on the part of the government, the case was handed over to me for private investigation by a number of English gentlemen at Johannesburg. From the early part of March to the commencement of September 1888, the prisoner was connected with others, and amongst them was one Carl Orpitz, in a banking swindle of £162,000 on the National Bank of Johannesburg. And he was also connected with a swindle known as the Great Kruger Gold Mining Company at Johannesburg, which floated in London for £110,000. Detective Brandt says he recognised the photograph of Frederick Bailey Deeming as that of the Deeming he knew, and he has referred to Mr. Alfred Harford, a member of Dampier's company at the Alexandra Theatre, for a corroboration of his statement. Harford said that he and Detective Brandt, who were acquainted with each other in South Africa, had been speaking upon the connection of the Victorian Deeming with the South African Deeming. What he remembered of the South African swindler was Deeming certainly had a Lancashire accent and was a confirmed braggart, as well as a past master in the art of swindling. Mr. Harford was a member of the stock company of the Theatre Royal, Johannesburg, and it was there that he first became acquainted with Deeming. At that time, Deeming was a prosperous man, and his name as a mining expert and engineer frequently figured at the bottom of the prospectuses of a few companies which really got beyond the floating stage. Later on, Orspitz turned up at Delagoa Bay, where he bought a dead body and buried it as his own, in order probably to put the police off his track. Deeming, who probably taught him this trick, was reported to have died and been buried at Durban. It was learned that he'd acquired a dead body of a miner who had died in the midst of strangers and had buried the body with due ceremony as his own, not even omitting to have the grave surmounted with a stone which set forth the name, age and virtues of Frederick Deeming, mining expert and engineer. And he was rumoured to have planted £11,000 in those graves. The Melbourne Age referred to the South African murders, saying that the magisterial inquiry followed and 2 Hottentot boys tendered evidence of a very important character, as it contained the possibility to identify the criminal. These boys happened to be standing under the veranda at the night in question when they saw a man wearing a long dark overcoat and a silk cap approach the victim Graham. There was some little conversation between the two, and then the first named individual raised a knockberry, which is an African wooden club, which he carried, and struck Graham a violent blow on the head. Then, drawing a knife from his pocket, he cut Graham's throat. Turning around after he finished his ghastly work, he found that a Kaffir and a Hottentot boy had been silent witnesses to the occurrence. Rushing madly towards them, he dealt them terrible blows with his knockberry, and subsequently he cut their throats, as he had done with the man Graham. The boys who gave evidence were under a veranda at the time, and being paralysed by fear, they made no sign. However, they saw sufficient of the assassin to enable them to furnish more or less a satisfactory description of him. The result of the detective's inquiries convinced him that Frederick Deeming was the assassin, but when he had sufficient information before him to warrant this assumption, it was found that Deeming's office was closed and that he himself had left the day after the crime had occurred. This circumstance was not noted as significant at the time, owing to the influx of people going in and out. It had been proven beyond a doubt that Deeming wore a silk cap and an overcoat. A man wearing this costume had been noted by the boys at the Trogadere Music Hall, And it is known that Deeming visited this resort on the night of the murder, and that he also was the last person seen in Graham's company on the night of the murder. It has been further ascertained that Deeming visited one of the women's tents, wearing a silk cap of the description of the one to which the allusion has been made. It has also been ascertained that some person in the tent exclaimed, "Why, that is blood you have on your cap," and Deeming immediately took it off his head in a paroxysm of passion, threw it upon the ground and stamped on it. Deeming had also been in the habit of carrying just such a knobkerrie as the boys saw need, and as the medical evidence showed, had been employed. The case was one which rested, chiefly of course on circumstantial evidence, but it was strong enough to have hanged the man if he could have been found. The other records from South Africa, that he killed a Zulu with a jackknife, that he slew 13 lions in a day. It also mentioned that he buried a wife at Johannesburg, so was he up to his old tricks and marrying quickly? Remember that his wife and children were sent to England straight away. It was also mentioned that he robbed a mail coach of 5,000 sovereigns as well. He was apparently quite closely connected with the Zulu tribes over there as well. And in South Africa, it was rumoured that he contracted syphilis from a prostitute, which they were using as part of the reason as to why he committed the further crimes that he did. So Marie Deeming arrived in Birkenhead in 1888, and it seems that Deeming arrived not long after her to evade arrest for the aforementioned misdemeanours. His brothers, Alfred and Walter, recalled that he came back to England with considerable money and jewellery. Apparently, when he left South Africa, he carried about printed cards, and on the printed cards it stated that he was the manager of the new Noffengart gold mine in Glogstop. When Deeming returned to England, he took a passage under the name of Levy on the RMS Jumna for Australia, and he left the boat at Aden. He appeared at Port Said, and then he immediately returned to Birkenhead. So he was shadowed by the police on his travels. So it says that he came via Algoa Bay in the steamer Drummond Castle to Durban, then to Mozambique in the Dunkeld, then to Aden in the steamer Baghdad, and then to London on the Jumna, arriving on the 28th September. He remained about a month in London, where he purchased a lion and then went to Birkenhead. He went under the surname of George, and those on the ship remembered Deeming well because of his ostentatious display of the jewellery and money and his unwanted attention to some of the female passengers. He was actually recognised by the captain of the Yumna as a passenger who travelled in that vessel from Aden under the name Levy. And then it leads to the date where it says that he spent about a month in London. It seems that he was in London from September 1888. And this was just in time for the Whitechapel murders, and you may recall as the murders by the name of Jack the Ripper. Over the course of approximately 2 months, a serial killer brutally murdered 5 women. Each victim had their throat cut and their body mutilated, indicating the murderer had considerable knowledge of the human anatomy. The victims were Mary Ann Nichols, whose body was found on the 31st of August, Annie Chapman, found on the 8th of September, Elizabeth Stride, found on the 30th of September, Kate Eddowes, found on the 30th of September, and Mary Jane Kelly, found on November the 9th. All victims were assumed to have been prostitutes. The first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was stabbed multiple times. The second was Annie Chapman, who was strangled and her uterus and part of her vagina removed. On the 30th of September, Elizabeth Stride had her throat slashed, and the same night, Catherine Eddowes had her face mutilated. She was stabbed and her left kidney and womb removed. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, her body was so badly dismembered her left arm was partially removed, her abdominal cavity was empty, her breasts and facial features were cut off, and she was severed from her neck to her spine. Her dismembered organs and body parts were placed in different areas around the room, and her heart was missing. A letter was sent to the police station where the writer claimed to be the infamous serial killer, signing the note with the name Jack the Ripper. The letter was addressed to the Central News Agency of London, and it was dated the 25th of September 1888. The letter was postmarked and received by the Central News Agency on the 27th of September, and the letter was then forwarded to the Scotland Yard on the 29th of September. The New York Times reported in April 1892 that Deeming has confessed to his lawyer and doctors who examined him that he committed the majority of the Jack the Ripper crimes in the Whitechapel district of London. The theory hinges on key similarities between Deeming and Ripper. Jack the Ripper is believed to detest sex workers. His behaviour is consistent with someone that may suffer from neurosyphilis, which involves mood disturbances, personality changes and forgetfulness, and in the later stages, memory and judgment impairment, confusion, delusion and seizures. One of the victims mutilated was Catherine Eddowes, and her last known sighting was at 1:35 a.m. when she was talking to a fair moustached man. Deeming allegedly knew Catherine Eddowes and was familiar with the Whitechapel area. After Deeming's arrest, a dressmaker told the London newspaper The Globe that she recognised Deeming from a photo as a man who she courted in London's East End in 1888, hours before and the day after 2 of the Ripper murders. She said the agitated man showed an intimate knowledge of the Ripper. He spoke of his travels abroad and wore ostentatious rings. When they met the next day, she said he was agitated and was eagerly reading the newspaper accounts of the murder. He'd said, "Look at the time, I could not have committed the murders." However, she claimed he displayed an intimate knowledge of Catherine Eddowes' mutilations. Among Deeming's effects, there was found an old rusty ulster with a cape to it, and the detectives seemed to place a good deal of importance on this, as in the description of Jack the Ripper, that individual always wore a long ulster with a cape attached, similar to the one found in Deeming's luggage. An ulster is a long coat that was commonly worn in Victorian Britain, similar to the overcoat that Sherlock Holmes used to wear. And this long sturdy coat often had an attached cape and a belt. Deeming told Dr. Andrew Shields when he was in jail in Australia that he had on occasions gone searching for a woman who he believed had given him syphilis, and he said he intended to kill her, and he believed in the extermination of all such women. Lamenting on his contraction of syphilis, he said with a peculiar intensity, "I've had my own back, anyhow, as more than one of them found out." Robin Napper, a former Scotland Yard detective and a forensic researcher, came to the conclusion that most of the evidence does lead to Deeming as Jack the Ripper, and this was outlined in a 2011 Discovery Channel documentary. According to Napper, the police had in fact always considered Deeming to be a prime suspect. The reason they dismissed Deeming, though, was that they believed he was either in jail at the time or he was in South Africa. Like the Ripper, Deeming liked to cut his victim's throat. With the Ripper, it was using surgical dissecting knives. A jeweller in Melbourne claimed that shortly after Deeming arrived, he was asked to clean a pair of blood-stained surgical knives. They actually did a comparison of writing of Deeming and the specimen that was sent in by Jack the Ripper. And in the British press, in the Illustrated Police News on the 16th of April 1892, there was a pictorial article and it's titled, "Is Deeming Jack the Ripper?" And I'll add that to my Facebook post. It was also indicated in an article in London that the detectives received information that Deeming had spent some time in Nova Scotia, and while there he received a letter from Catherine Eddowes, who was one of the murdered women. An article in 1892 after his arrest said that calculations made at Perth conclusively said that Deeming cannot be Jack the Ripper, as under the name of Ward he arrived at Cape Town just about the date of the first Whitechapel murder, which occurred on the 3rd of April 1888. And he remained in the Cape Colony during the whole period of the murders under his own name, Deeming. Well, we do know that he did arrive around that date, the one where they happened on the same day, and the same method of death for 2 of the victims. So my theory is that although he didn't commit all of the murders of the women that were found in London at the time, there's certainly 2 of them that could easily have been the victims of Deeming. Early in 1889, the solicitor was acting on behalf of 2 important Cape and Australian merchants who had been victimised. It said that Deeming appeared at Durban, representing himself as a mining engineer, about to proceed to Johannesburg to take up some concessions and open up what he described as the most finest mining properties in the world. This land, according to Deeming, was the perfect El Dorado and would make enormous fortunes for those that associated with it. He succeeded in worming his way into the confidence of a gentleman in Durban named Wilson, and so impressed him with his story that Mr. Wilson advanced £600 to enable him to begin operations. After obtaining this money, Deeming, with the aid of a confederate, who also has since disappeared, set about a greater swindle. They went to Cape Town, where they remained for a few days, and then Deeming started for Johannesburg. On his arrival there, he was put up in the best hotel on Mr. Wilson's money, lived in a most lavish fashion, and by his affability and liberal expenditure soon gained the acquaintance of a number of residents. Among those he honoured with particular intimacy was a jeweller named Ansell and a mining secretary named Grice. Deeming had in his possession at the time a number of deeds purporting to refer to grants of property and mining rights over a large tract of country in South Africa, and these he showed to Grice and Ansell, telling them that he was about to develop his property and make the most generous promises to them as what he would do when the enormous wealth that he talked of was realised. By the 1st of April 1899, there was an account by a man that knew Deeming, and he stated that he had a wife called Alice A. Williams, who lived in Sydney, and she was boarding at the Pine Tree House in Darling Street. The man's account said that by May 1889, that Deeming returned to London on the Iberia, which he had been a steward, and that he had to withdraw from service to the company because he took his wife on board with him to sail to London, which was against the rules. And interestingly, at this time in Melbourne, there was a big gold heist, and this occurred in May 1889, and this robbery is covered in a lot more depth in bonus episode 17. I suggest that you pause at this moment and have a listen to this bonus episode to understand the details of this robbery, and then recommence back into part 2 of this episode. In part 2, I'll be covering the events that ensued once Frederick Deeming returned to England. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes